let's take a look at what we talked about over the last week. Episode 190 was Ezekiel 8 and 9, had us in what I call the man clothed in linen. This is where we begin to see the glory of the Lord departing from the temple. And the glory of the Lord is departing from Jerusalem. The glory of the Lord is leaving. Now remember, it's super important that Ezekiel 8, 9, 10, and 11, those 4 chapters of Ezekiel, are all a vision that Ezekiel is having. Ezekiel is not actually in Jerusalem. He's in Babylon, and he is having this vision of what's going on in Jerusalem. And then this key thing in chapter 9 was God called for judgment against Jerusalem, and he recruited 6 warriors, each with weapons for slaughter in their hand. But then there was a 7th guy, the guy with the linen writing case, and God told him what? Go throughout the land of Jerusalem, put a mark on the forehead of everyone who is grief-stricken over their sin. And he came back and said, I've done as you've told me to do. And then God sent the 6 warriors and said, go and destroy everybody who does not have my mark on his head. That should make us think of Revelation. That should make us think of the last days when those who know and trust God have been marked and sealed, having his name written on their foreheads, and they are not destroyed. But also the glory of God departing should make us think a little bit of Ichabod from back in 1 Samuel. Now, when we get over to the rest of that vision in chapters 10 and 11, episode 191, we see the glory of God continuing from the Holy of Holies out to the east, or the threshold of the temple, outside with the 4 living creatures, and then off the mountain away from the city of Jerusalem. The glory of God is departing. And one of the things that we saw in this text that was really interesting is we see Ezekiel have this vision of some 25 elders who are ministering in the temple of the Lord. We saw this a little bit in chapters 8 and 9 as well. They've filled the temple of the Lord with idols and all sorts of profane things. They're serving these idols. And then judgment is being pronounced against these wicked leaders of the nation of Jerusalem. And there is a promise here in chapter 11, which is a beautiful promise that we saw also in chapter 36, that God is going to restore these people and give them a new heart and a new heart and a new covenant, new heart and a new spirit, according to the new covenant that he's going to build with them. And that new covenant is the covenant of Christ. Remember, it's not that there's the old covenant and then intermediary covenant and then the covenant of Christ. The old covenant was the works of the law. The new covenant is grace through Christ. And so Ezekiel's vision comes to a close, and then he tells all the people in Chaldea, he tells all the people in Babylon what God had shown him. Ezekiel 13 through 16, long section, but I really want to focus on Ezekiel 16. That is where God refers to himself as the husband to the people of Jerusalem. He found Jerusalem, a child abandoned in its birth waste. He raised it, he grew it. When Jerusalem became an adult woman, it's all figurative language, he betrothed himself to her, and he joined himself to Jerusalem, and he wanted to make her a beautiful bride, and he lavished care on her and grace on her and mercy on her and adorned her so that her fame went throughout the whole world. And then how did Jerusalem thank God? Jerusalem didn't thank God. Instead, Jerusalem turned to all these other idols and Jerusalem offered herself to all these other gods and became a faithless bride, did not serve God well. Remember, the language of the bride and the husband is used throughout the Bible to indicate a relationship with God. We see it particularly in Ephesians 5, where it says, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And down at the end of Ephesians 5, it says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm not speaking about husbands and wives. I'm speaking about Christ and the church. And then we also see it in 1 Corinthians 6, where a father and a son are sharing a wife. And God said, this is an abomination. This is profane. And he says, don't you know that anyone who joins himself to the Lord becomes one in flesh with the Lord, talking again about marriage. So God uses marriage language to talk about the kind of relationship he desires with his people. And then when you get over here to Ezekiel 18 and 20, the soul who sins will die. This was episode 193. The soul who sins will die. He said, no more will you say that the father will eat sour grapes and the children's teeth will be set on edge. No more will that be the case. Instead, what we'll do from now on is the soul who sins will die. If the father sins, the children won't bear it. The father will bear it. And he says, if the father sins, but he has a righteous son, then the righteous son will live because of his righteousness and not be punished for his father's sinfulness. But if that righteous son has a wicked son, that wicked son will not survive because of his father's righteousness. He'll die for his own wickedness. Please keep in mind, that is not new covenant language. That is old covenant language. So don't fold that forward and try to make it about us today. Ezekiel 20, He reminded the people who they had been, how they had rejected, like the forefathers. So he's kind of using the same language. The forefathers of the Hebrews had rejected God, did not go into the promised land, disbelieved God. And now the people in this day and age in Ezekiel 20 are still disbelieving in God, still rejecting God, and God blesses them. Why? And he, well, not blesses them, he's disciplining them at this point, but God preserves them, doesn't destroy them completely. Why? Well, he does it for his own name's sake. He does it because of the promise and the covenant that he has made, but not for any righteousness of their own. And then episode 194 was Ezekiel 6 and Ezekiel 36, where there are two prophecies to the mountains. Ezekiel 36 was a prophecy to the mountains that God was going to bring destruction on the mountains and take all the people away. But Ezekiel 36 was a prophecy to the mountains that what? God was going to restore the people, rebuild Jerusalem, and make the mountains that were desolate flourish again and have life again. And then Ezekiel 37 and 47 was episode 195 for us. Two different visions of Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones, and then also the river of life. And so the valley of dry bones was the state of Israel at this current place in time where they had rejected God, they had forsaken God, turned away from him, and God said, can they live again? Can they have life again? Yes, they will. I will rebuild them. I will bring them back. I will bring them back to me and make them people of my own. There's also the promise here in chapter 6, chapter 37. There's also the promise here of taking Judah and Israel and making them into one nation again and giving them one king, David, one shepherd over them who will rule them and bring about peace. And that's a reference to Christ. And then Ezekiel 47 also gives us a reference to Christ because it shows us the water of the river of life that flows out from the altar of God, and everywhere it flows, it brings life and healing, in the same way that we see the river of life flowing forward from the throne of Jesus in Revelation 22. Everywhere it goes, it brings life and healing as well. And then our last episode this week, we started Daniel. We were in Daniel 1 through 3. This was episode 146. And we saw that Daniel is a bit of a rewind. It is actually prior to the events that we've already looked at in Ezekiel, at least prior to some of the events that we saw in Ezekiel. And Daniel comes into Babylon the first year of King Nebuchadnezzar, but by the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are in leadership positions in Babylon. And we see that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in chapter 3, we're not told the timeline on this. We're not sure when this part happens, the thrown into the fiery furnace, but they are asked to bow down and worship an idol that King Nebuchadnezzar has made, and they reject that. They refuse to do that, and they say, look, God is able to save us from this fiery furnace, but even if he does not, we will serve no one but him. At this point, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are already in leadership in Babylon. Daniel is ruling over Babylon, and they are cast into the fire, and they are rescued by God, by an angel of the Lord, and they come out, and Nebuchadnezzar gives glory to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and says that any nation, any person who speaks wickedly against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they will be torn limb from limb and their houses will become a rubble. And so what's interesting is, and we don't think about this, but Babylon is the world power at this time. And so when Nebuchadnezzar sends out a decree to all his people saying, hey, don't speak anything bad about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, otherwise we're going to kill you. When you get that decree in your mailbox, or the herald comes down your street proclaiming that, what's the first question you're going to ask? You're going to be like, well, who's that God? I need to be sure I don't say anything bad about that God. Tell me who that God is. And so I've always thought that this was beautiful because God uses Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to basically make his name known in the world at that point, because Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that goes throughout his entire kingdom, which is more than just Babylon, because they've attacked a lot of people and they've taken over a lot of nations. And so the name of God is distributed throughout the earth because of that. And so that is a really quick summary of this past week as we looked at Ezekiel and Daniel. And we're still in Daniel, so join us tomorrow in our regular scheduled stuff, and we will be in Daniel 4 through 6. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.